What happens when a Hollywood legend meets a host determined to make headlines at any cost? You won't believe what unfolds when Clint Eastwood sits down with George Stephanopoulos for what was supposed to be a straightforward promotional appearance. Last night's explosive confrontation left viewers stunned as America's most iconic tough guy found himself under relentless attack from an interviewer who seemed more interested in creating controversy than conducting journalism. The tension that built throughout their exchange would ultimately lead to one of the most dramatic walkouts in television history. But it all started with what seemed like innocent questions about Eastwood's latest film. The studio lights cast their familiar warm glow as Clint Eastwood settled into the guest chair across from George Stephanopoulos, his weathered hands folded calmly in his lap. At 94, the legendary actor and director still commanded presence, his steely blue eyes alert. Despite the late hour, the show's producers had promised a simple conversation about his upcoming documentary project, a retrospective on American heroism that Eastwood had been passionate about for months. "Welcome back to the show, Clint." Stephanopoulos began with his practiced television smile, shuffling through his notes with an almost theatrical precision. "It's always a pleasure to have you here." Eastwood nodded curtly, his expression neutral but watchful. Years of Hollywood interviews had taught him to read the room, and something in the host's demeanor already felt different tonight. There was an edge to Stephanopoulos' voice, a barely contained excitement that suggested this wouldn't be the promotional softball session his publicist had arranged. "Your new documentary explores what you call real American heroes," Stephanopoulos continued, leaning forward slightly. "But I have to ask, in today's political climate, don't you think that kind of messaging might be seen as exclusionary, particularly given some of your past statements about certain political figures?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunfight. Eastwood's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady. "I'm not sure what you're getting at, George. The film is about ordinary people who did extraordinary things. Firefighters, teachers, soldiers, people who put others before themselves. But your definition of heroism has always been rather narrow, hasn't it?" Stephanopoulos pressed, his tone sharpening. "I mean, you famously spoke to an empty chair at the Republican National Convention, mocking a sitting president. Some would say that was hardly heroic behavior." The studio audience, which had been murmuring appreciatively during the opening pleasantries, fell silent. Even the camera operators seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. Eastwood's publicist, watching from the wings, took a step forward, her face creased with concern. "That was political commentary," Eastwood replied, his voice carrying the weight of measured patience. "I've never claimed to be a hero myself. I'm an entertainer who happens to have opinions just like every other American citizen." Stephanopoulos laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "Just like every other citizen. Come now, Clint. You've used your platform to influence elections, to shape public opinion. Don't you think that comes with certain responsibilities, especially when some of those opinions have been, shall we say, controversial?" The camera zoomed in on Eastwood's face, catching the subtle tightening around his eyes. This wasn't the first time he dealt with hostile interviewers, but there was something particularly aggressive about Stephanopoulos' approach tonight. The host seemed to be building towards something, each question more loaded than the last. "I think every American has the right to express their views," Eastwood said carefully. "That's what makes this country great, the fact that we can disagree and still sit in the same room and have a conversation. But is it really a conversation when one person has a platform that reaches millions and uses it to spread what many consider to be divisive rhetoric?" Stephanopoulos shot back, his voice rising slightly. "Your comments about immigration, about social justice movements, about the political establishment. Don't you see how those words carry weight beyond just one man's opinion?" The tension in the studio was now palpable. Crew members exchanged glances, unsure whether they were witnessing masterful journalism or something more sinister. Eastwood shifted in his chair, his famous composure beginning to show the first hairline cracks. "I've always spoken my mind," he said, his voice carrying a warning tone that anyone familiar with his films would recognize. "I don't apologize for having convictions, and I don't apologize for expressing them. If that makes some people uncomfortable, well, maybe they need to examine why the truth bothers them so much." Stephanopoulos pounced on the opening like a predator sensing weakness. The truth? Is that what you call it when you suggest that entire groups of Americans are somehow less patriotic than others? When you imply that people fighting for civil rights are somehow undermining the very values you claim to champion? Now, hold on just a minute, Eastwood said, his voice dropping to that familiar growly whisper that had intimidated countless movie villains. I never said anything like that, and you know it. You're twisting my words, putting meanings into them that were never there. The host leaned back in his chair with visible satisfaction, as if he'd been waiting for exactly this moment. Am I? Because I have the quotes right here, Clint. Would you like me to read them back to you? Your exact words about protesters, about immigrants, about what you consider to be real Americans. Eastwood's hands clenched into fists on the armrests of his chair. 40 years of dealing with Hollywood politics, with difficult directors, and demanding studios had taught him patience. But something about Stephanopoulos' smug expression, the way he was clearly enjoying this ambush, was testing limits that few people had ever dared to approach. You can read whatever you want, Eastwood said quietly. But context matters, George. The situations I was responding to, the questions I was asked, the conversations I was having, all of that matters. You can't just pull sentences out
of interviews from years ago and use them to paint whatever picture serves your agenda. My agenda? Stephanopoulos' eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. I'm simply asking you to take responsibility for your words, to acknowledge that when someone of your stature speaks, people listen, and when those words divide rather than unite, when they marginalize rather than include, don't you think that's worth examining? The studio lights seemed to grow hotter, casting harsh shadows across both men's faces. Eastwood's legendary cool was beginning to evaporate like morning mist under the California sun, and everyone in the room could feel the change in temperature. But this was only the beginning of what would become one of the most explosive confrontations in television history. The commercial break couldn't have come at a worse time for Stephanopoulos' producers, who were frantically signaling from behind the cameras, but the host waved them off with barely concealed irritation, his eyes never leaving Eastwood's increasingly stony expression. When they returned to air, the temperature in the studio had somehow managed to climb even higher. "We're back with Clint Eastwood," Stephanopoulos announced to the camera, his media-trained smile looking more predatory than welcoming. "And we were just discussing your influence on American political discourse. I think our viewers deserve to know where you really stand on some of these issues." Eastwood's publicist had used the break to whisper urgently in his ear, but whatever advice she'd given seemed to have fallen on deaf ears. The legendary actor sat straighter in his chair, his jaw set in a way that anyone who'd watched his westerns would recognize as dangerous. "You know what, George?" Eastwood said, his voice carrying that slow, measured cadence that had intimidated outlaws on screen for decades. "I came here tonight to talk about a documentary celebrating everyday heroes. Teachers who work overtime to help struggling kids, firefighters who run into burning buildings, police officers who put their lives on the line every day. But you seem more interested in playing gotcha journalism than actually discussing the people who make this country work." Stephanopoulos leaned forward, sensing blood in the water. "But that's exactly my point, Clint. Your definition of heroism seems to exclude certain groups. What about the activists fighting for voting rights? The protesters demanding police accountability? The immigrants building better lives for their families? Don't they deserve recognition too?" "Of course they do," Eastwood replied, but his voice was getting sharper now. "But you're trying to twist this into something it's not. You're looking for controversy where none exists because that's what drives ratings, isn't it? That's what this is really about." The accusation hit Stephanopoulos like a slap across the face. His practiced composure flickered for just a moment, revealing something uglier underneath. "I think I'm asking the questions that matter, Clint. The questions that millions of Americans want answered. Your films have always dealt with themes of justice and morality, but your real-world positions seem to contradict those very themes." "My real-world positions?" Eastwood's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow it carried more menace than if he'd been shouting. You mean my belief that people should work hard, take responsibility for their actions, and respect the institutions that keep our society functioning? You mean my belief that America, despite its flaws, is still the greatest country on earth? Those positions. Stephanopoulos pounced on the opening like a shark, sensing wounded prey. But what about when those institutions fail people, Clint? What about when the system you champion excludes entire communities? When the police you defend kill unarmed citizens? When the America you celebrate was built on the backs of people who were never meant to share in its promises? The studio felt deadly quiet. Even the camera operators stopped their usual subtle movements, as if afraid that any sound might break the spell of what was unfolding before them. Eastwood's hands gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. "Now you listen to me," Eastwood said, his voice carrying the full weight of his 9 decades on Earth. "I've lived through more history than you can imagine. I've seen this country at its best and its worst. I've watched it grow and change and struggle to live up to its ideals. And yes, we've made mistakes, terrible mistakes. But we've also done something that no other nation in history has managed to do. We've constantly tried to get better. But have you tried to get better, Clint?" Stephanopoulos interrupted, his voice rising with excitement. "Or have you just gotten more entrenched in views that many Americans find outdated and harmful? Your comments about gender equality, about climate change, about social programs. They paint a picture of someone who's been left behind by progress." Eastwood's eyes flashed with something dangerous. "Left behind by progress? Son, I was making movies about racial reconciliation when you were still in diapers. I was exploring themes of redemption and second chances when your idea of journalism was reading other people's homework. Don't lecture me about progress, but actions speak louder than movies, don't they?" Stephanopoulos shot back, clearly enjoying himself now. "And your actions, your political endorsements, your public statements, they tell a different story. They tell the story of someone who's more comfortable with the America that was than the America that's becoming." The mask was completely off. Now, whatever pretense of journalistic objectivity Stephanopoulos had maintained at the beginning of the interview was gone, replaced by naked hostility. He was no longer asking questions. He was making accusations, building a case against his guest like a prosecutor addressing a jury. Eastwood leaned forward in his chair, his famous squint more pronounced than ever. "You want to know what makes me uncomfortable, George? It's watching journalists abandon their responsibility to inform the public in favor of pushing their own political agenda. It's seeing the media become a weapon instead of a tool for truth." "A weapon?" Stephanopoulos laughed. But there was no humor in it. "That's rich coming from someone who's used his platform to attack everyone from environmental activists to civil rights leaders. You want to talk about weapons? What about the damage done by your words, your influence, your refusal to acknowledge that times have changed?" The confrontation had reached a fever pitch. What had started as a tense interview had devolved into something resembling a street fight, with both men circling each other like predators looking for the killing blow. The studio audience sat in stunned silence, unsure whether they were witnessing television history or a career-ending disaster for both participants. "My refusal to acknowledge that times have changed," Eastwood repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. "Times change, George, but principles don't. Integrity doesn't. The difference between right and wrong doesn't change just because it becomes fashionable to pretend otherwise." Stephanopoulos sensed his moment and went for the throat. "And there it is, ladies and gentlemen, the real Clint Eastwood, the man who thinks he's the sole arbiter of right and wrong, who believes his way of seeing the world is the only valid perspective. Tell me, Clint, what gives you the right to decide what's moral for the rest of us?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to a duel, and everyone in the studio knew that whatever came next would determine how this confrontation would be remembered. For a moment that felt like an eternity, Clint Eastwood sat perfectly still, his weathered face a mask of controlled fury. The studio lights caught the steel in his eyes as he processed what had just been said to him. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that the boom operator had to lean in to catch every word. "What gives me the right?" Eastwood repeated slowly, as if tasting each syllable. 94 years of living, George. 94 years of watching this country struggle with its demons and come out stronger. Serving in the army during Korea. Raising a family. Building a career from nothing. Making mistakes and learning from them. That's what gives me the right to have an opinion. Stephanopoulos sensed he was losing control of the narrative and doubled down with desperate aggression. But opinions aren't facts, Clint. Your experience isn't everyone's experience. Your America isn't the only America. And frankly, some of us are tired of being lectured by Hollywood elites who think their success gives them moral authority over the rest of us. The irony of the statement wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Here was a man who had spent decades in elite media circles in the corridors of political power, calling someone else an out-of-touch elite. But Eastwood didn't take the bait. Instead, he did something that caught everyone off guard. He smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. Hollywood elite. Eastwood chuckled, shaking his head. That's funny. Coming from someone who went from ABC News to working for a Clinton administration and back to ABC News. But you know what, George? You're absolutely right about one thing. My experience isn't everyone's experience. He paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. My experience includes growing up poor during the Depression, digging swimming pools and logging trees to pay for acting classes. Being told I'd never make it because I was too tall, too quiet, too different. My experience includes being drafted into the army and serving my country without complaint. It includes making movies that celebrated the complexity of the human condition, not just the parts that made people comfortable. Stephanopoulos tried to interrupt, but Eastwood held up a hand that silenced him as effectively as if he'd drawn a gun. But here's what really gets me, George, Eastwood continued, his voice gaining strength with every word. You invited me here under false pretenses. You told my people this was going to be about the documentary, about celebrating everyday heroes. Instead, you've spent the last 20 minutes trying to destroy me on national television for having the audacity to think differently than you do. The host's face flushed red as he realized his ambush had backfired spectacularly. I'm simply holding you accountable for your public statements, Clint. That's what journalism is supposed to do. Journalism? Eastwood's laugh was sharp as broken glass. Is that what you call this? Twisting quotes, taking things out of context, building straw-man arguments to tear down. This isn't journalism, son. This is a hit job. The accusation hit Stephanopoulos like a physical blow. His carefully constructed media persona began to crumble as he struggled to regain the offensive. That's a serious allegation, Clint. Are you suggesting that I've been dishonest in my questioning? Eastwood leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking more relaxed than he had all evening. The shift in his demeanor was unsettling, like watching a cat stop stalking and start playing with its prey. I'm not suggesting anything, George. I'm stating it flat out. You've been dishonest from the moment I walked in here. This whole setup, this ambush interview disguised as a friendly chat, it's beneath the dignity of real journalism. It's the kind of gotcha garbage that's destroying people's faith in the media. The studio audience, which had been silent throughout most of the confrontation, began to murmur among themselves. Some were clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, while others seemed energized by the raw display of conflict. But all of them could sense that something significant was happening, that they were watching the unraveling of carefully maintained professional facades. Stephanopoulos made one last desperate attempt to regain control. So now you're blaming the media for asking tough questions. This is exactly the kind of deflection we've come to expect from people who can't defend their positions. You came on this show, Clint. Nobody forced you to be here. That was the final straw. Eastwood's composure, which had been hanging by a thread throughout the entire ordeal, finally snapped. But instead of exploding in anger, he went completely cold. And somehow that was infinitely more frightening. "You're absolutely right, George," Eastwood said, his voice deadly calm as he began to remove his microphone. "Nobody forced me to be here, and nobody's forcing me to stay." The realization of what was happening hit everyone in the studio simultaneously. Camera operators scrambled to get better angles. Producers frantically gestured from the wings, and Stephanopoulos' face went from red to pale in a matter of seconds. "Now wait just a minute, Clint," the host stammered, his practiced television demeanor completely abandoned. "We're in the middle of a live broadcast. You can't just watch me," Eastwood said simply, standing up from his chair with the fluid grace of a man half his age. He handed the microphone to a stunned stage manager and turned back to face Stephanopoulos one final time. "You know what the real tragedy is here, George. You had a chance to have a real conversation tonight. You could have asked about the documentary, about the people we're trying to honor, about what it means to be a hero in today's world. Instead, you chose to turn this into a circus. You chose spectacle over substance, controversy over conversation." Stephanopoulos, desperate to salvage something from the wreckage of his ambush, called out as Eastwood began walking toward the exit. "So, you're just going to run away when the questions get tough? Is that how the great Clint Eastwood handles adversity?" Eastwood stopped at the edge of the stage and turned around one last time. The camera caught him in perfect profile, the studio lights creating dramatic shadows across his iconic features. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of experience and the unmistakable authority of a man who had nothing left to prove. "No, George, I'm not running away from tough questions. I'm walking away from a man who's forgotten the difference between asking tough questions and being a bully. There's a difference between journalism and whatever this was supposed to be. And frankly, I'm too old and too tired to waste any more time trying to explain that difference to someone who clearly doesn't want to understand it." With that, Clint Eastwood turned and walked off the set, leaving behind a stunned studio audience, a flustered host, and a moment of television that would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. The cameras continued rolling as Stephanopoulos sat alone at his desk, trying desperately to regain his composure and figure out how to fill the remaining minutes of his program. But the damage was done. In trying to ambush a legend, he had instead revealed himself to be exactly the kind of media manipulator that had destroyed public trust in journalism. And as Eastwood's footsteps faded into the distance, everyone in that studio knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary. The moment when integrity walked away from a fight. It refused to dignify with its presence.